Good evening. I'm Jamie Steam, class of 82. We're delighted that you're here with us today to discuss democracy under fire here at the Capitol, where I am right now. I'm a journalist who covers Congress. With me is Alex Friedfeld, class of 2012. Alex is a researcher with the Anti-Defamation League in New York. He's an expert on extremist groups like Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, and he has a fascinating story to tell about the mob storming the Capitol on January 6th, because he was tracking their online communications before, during, and after the attack. Meanwhile, I was here in the House chamber where I witnessed the siege. I remember it all too well. We're going to share and compare our journeys through that day. And in the second part of the hour, we're happy to take your questions. So I want to also thank the Alumni Council for hosting this event. And I am a member of the Alumni Council, and it's a wonderful way to connect with the Swarthmore community writ large. And I will ask Alex if I may take first vignette of the day when I was walking through the Capitol grounds. Is that all right?
Yeah, absolutely.
At noon on January 6th, I was on the Capitol grounds, and I had the sense of dread because I passed a crowd, very boisterous crowd, that was pledging allegiance to the Trump flag and to the republic for which he stands. So that was my first sign of trouble at noon on January 6th, on my way to the People's House of Representatives. Alice?
Sure, thank you. Before I get started, I just want to say thank you to Jamie and Alumni Council for having me. Really looking forward to this conversation. And also just a note that if you have any questions, please paste them into the chat, with your name and your class here. But yeah, Jamie, that may have been kind of the first time you saw trouble coming, but the fact of the matter is the trouble, that was a long time coming. The insurrection in my mind was shocking, but it wasn't surprising. And frankly, it was actually pretty predictable. The reason why I say that, right, is it wasn't surprising because the insurrection was really kind of a remix of all these things that we had seen throughout 2020, turned to 11, right? So things like, this breakdown in the norm against carrying weapons in public spaces during protests, right? This idea that it's okay to actually send, a message of intimidation through violence, to policymakers who aren't doing things that you like, right? This kind of mix of extremists and ordinary Americans in these crowds, which not only created opportunities for extremists to radicalize other people, it created kind of this powder keg situation, right? Where you didn't exactly know what was going to happen. Right? And that's not to say that the insurrection was only carried out by extremists, but it's clear that they played a major role in instigating the violence that was to come that day. We saw this kind of proliferations of conspiracies, right, which is something that we had been monitoring all year for all sorts of different issues, whether it was COVID or the BLM protests, the George Floyd protests over the summer, right? But almost immediately on November 3rd, we saw this kind of, rise of conspiracies saying that the election was stolen, by Democrats who are looking to, launch a coup or impose socialism or impose tyranny or any number of terrible things, right? If you are a QAnon supporter, right, you believe that there are pedophiles that are trying to run the country. Right. And all of this is dangerous because it raises the stakes of the moment, from simple disagreements into apocalyptic, existential crises that need, similarly extensive, means of rectifying those problems. Right. And even the idea of storming the Capitol was something that we saw happen 4 times at state capitals across the country. Twice in Lansing, Michigan, once in Oregon, and once in Idaho, right? So all of this stuff was kind of stuff that we had seen, play out at earlier parts in the year. But the event itself was eminently predictable. And the reason why I say that is because the people involved told us exactly what they were going to do on that day, right? All over the internet, people were espousing violent rhetoric. They were sharing violent fantasies about killing politicians, about killing the left, about killing media people, right? About storming the Capitol. I mean, that phrase was all over the internet. And, normally, right, that type of rhetoric actually isn't all that surprising. I mean, I'm in extremist spaces all day, and day in and day out, and we usually see that type of rhetoric. But what was surprising about that, the rhetoric that we were seeing, was how it wasn't just limited to extremist spaces. It was everywhere. It was on Facebook, it was on Instagram, it was on Reddit, it was on Twitter, right? All of these sorts of places, where anyone can consume it, right? And even more concerning, it was combined with logistical planning. Right? It wasn't just these guys talking in the abstract. All of a sudden, they were talking about like what weapons are okay to bring to DC. Guns were not allowed, but can you bring a knife? Can you bring a baton? Can you bring a baseball bat? Which I saw some people talking about. Right? They were sharing ride share information. Right? We're renting a bus from here to get to DC. Come hop on. Some people were even sharing hotel information. Like, I'm going to be here. There's still some rooms available. Grab them so we can get as many people as we can. Right? It just takes it out of this abstract content and starts to kind of ground it more in the reality of that moment. Right? And so when you look at it kind of in totality, right, there was this sense that up until January 6th, politics were okay. Right. And you had, you use the means at your disposal, which is why you saw that rally in DC, those two rallies in DC, one in November, one in December. Right. But after January 6th, if the Congress refused to decertify the election, and if Pence did not step up, to do what was necessary, then all bets were off. Violence is fair game, war is fair game, whatever it takes to save the country, from apocalypse, right? And so you saw speeches to that end the night before with Alex Jones riling people up, and Stuart Rhodes of the Oath Keepers was making speeches all over the place, right? And then you get to the morning, where you've got, folks, giving very violent talks at the Capitol, egging the crowd on, including, the president at the time, right? And so everything was a powder keg just waiting to spark.
So I have a question. It was clear to me that the mob was much better organized than the Capitol Police, and that you had a much clearer picture of what was coming than the FBI, other authorities, even Congress and the press. Why do you think that the FBI did so little to prevent this?
That's an excellent question, and one we're still trying to get to the bottom of. We still are missing critical details about kind of the planning for January 6th. But the fact of the matter is, this was an intelligence failure. This stuff was all over the internet for anyone to see. Various watchdogs were ringing alarm bells saying you have a problem here, sending memos, sending alerts. And there's been reports that even the intelligence community knew about this. And yet, for whatever reason, we don't know exactly why, right? There was a disconnect between the intelligence and the planning, for that day.
Yeah.
But I mean, you saw the results of that firsthand.
I surely did. The Capitol Police did not even have every officer on duty that day. I can tell you that it's because of the Metropolitan Police, the DC city force. That's the reason that we were saved, because they sent 800 officers to the scene to engage in hand-to-hand combat with the mob. And the Capitol Police leadership was woefully unprepared. And you may have a comment on why that. Do you have any insight into why they were so poorly prepared and they locked up their weapons? They had no idea, or professed to have no idea, of the tidal wave of anger and violence that was heading in the tens of thousands of people toward the Capitol.
Yeah, no, I mean, again, it's mind-boggling to this day why they were so ill-prepared. Like I said, all of these warning signs were there that this is going to be a big deal. Certainly the morning of, when you see the crowds coming in, you would think that they would reinforce it, right? And yet there was this critical gap where the National Guard wasn't called in for several hours, to deal with this. And when you look at the footage from that day, those poor police officers, you've only got a few hundred that are standing off of, a riotous crowd of thousands. There was no chance that they were going to be able to keep those crowds out. So they did, heroic work, doing what they could to control it. But at a certain point, the levee was going to break.
And we also know that about 20% of the Oath Keepers are ex-military. So they came in formation, they scaled walls, they were incredibly coordinated. And so this was not an overnight, impulse to come to Washington. It could not have been spontaneous.
No, certainly not. I mean, we certainly have seen from the recent documents released regarding the Oath Keepers, and Stewart Rhodes and sedition charges, that these guys had a very clear plan for what they wanted to do, right? I mean, this is the first time where first time that the government has acknowledged that there was a coordinated plot to oppose the transfer of power, right? Essentially overthrow the government. And that, again, was led by the Oath Keepers, many of which had military backgrounds, right? So they knew how to operate in chaotic environments, right? And it's very
Wearing
telling.
helmets.
Right. When you watch that footage, you can spot the Oath Keepers from a mile away because they're the ones moving methodically in a stack formation, piercing through that crowd to get into the Capitol. They knew what they were doing. The only reason why they weren't at the forefront is likely because they had to go change. They didn't come dressed like that. They got new gear and put it on and then returned.
And
to do the deed. But the Proud Boys were there.
Can you speak to the sedition charge against Stewart Rhodes?
Absolutely. So this is very relevant. I mean, Stewart Rhodes just got charged a week and a half ago at this point, but he was in court this afternoon for his detention hearing. So essentially, the government is accusing Stewart Rhodes and 10 other Oath Keepers of conspiracy to commit sedition, right? Which is this idea that they were essentially going to revolt. And so they essentially argue that there was a coordinated plot by the Oath Keepers launched on November 3rd to oppose the peaceful transfer of power, from President Trump to President Biden. And everything that in those documents is in line with what we know about the Oath Keepers and their activities, right? Stewart Rhodes was publicly calling for revolution, calling for the Insurrection Act to be imposed, to be invoked, against leftists, right? Use whatever force necessary. He was practically begging President Trump to call the militias to act. There was all of this kind of apocalyptic language of blood in the streets that you have to fight now. Otherwise, you'll have a far bloodier fight in the future, right? And again, this is incredibly important development in the legal prosecutions against these, the insurrectionists, because it's the first time that the government has acknowledged its plot, right? Up until this point, the folks charged in connection with the insurrection have been charged with, relatively minor crimes of trespassing or impeding government processes, things of that nature. This again is a major escalation, as opposed to those people who are facing only, up to a few years in prison. Rhodes will be looking at 20 years in prison because of this. And it also kind of expands the range of these prosecutions, right? Everyone up until this point had either, again, breached the Capitol or were charged for violent actions that they did outside of the Capitol. To our knowledge at this point, Stewart Rhodes did neither of those things. He never set foot in the Capitol, and we don't believe that he was involved with any overt violent acts by himself, right? But instead, what the government is going after him for is, coordinating and organizing logistics to get the Oath Keepers from around the country into the Capitol. And that's a big deal, because not only does it mean that he could be held liable for his, his underlings' actions, it also means that those charges can now be applied to other extremist groups like the Proud Boys, who did similar things.
Right. That's for my own sense of, dealing with the whole trauma. I went to one of the sentencings of the man in horns and a helmet who took over the Senate, the vice president. Yes, he was sentenced to 41 months. And there was a sense of vindication or satisfaction to see him come to justice. The Senate chamber was breached, but the House chamber was not. I was in the House chamber that day, and each one was full of lawmakers, because January 6th was not chosen by accident. That was the day in the Constitution that Congress was going to certify the Electoral college count. So the president and the conspirators knew essentially Congress would be captive in the Capitol if they could take it over. And Vice President Pence was presiding over the Senate at the same time as Speaker Pelosi was presiding over the House. This is usually a snap, but we knew it was going to be a long day's journey into night because a lot of Republican lawmakers were going to challenge results. Yet, we did not know that Pence and Pelosi were in grave danger. And they're second and third in line to the presidency. So everything was just so perfectly set up for an attack of this kind, which had never happened before in American history,
Right.
Not even during the Civil War. There had never been a war within when Americans attacked the Capitol. The
Right.
British burned it in 1814, but that's a legitimate act of war, and the Capitol was deserted. The city was deserted. The president fled on horseback. So it was absolutely unheard of and hard to grasp while it was happening. Did you have a hard time really believing your eyes?
Yeah, I mean, I remember thinking, right? I remember like coming back afterwards and just kind of reflecting on the day. And again, I was not surprised. Like I said, I wasn't surprised that this happened. And yet, right, there's the American in me that was like, wait, how can this happen here, right? I mean, that's what, we're always told growing up that this is the thing that separates us from everybody else is our electoral system, right? We are a democracy. We transfer power peacefully. We work together. Yes, we have flaws, but over time, we generally work to correct them, right? And instead, what you have on that day is a not insignificant, amount of people basically taking a sledgehammer to the foundations of our nation.
Literally.
Right. I mean, like, it's like, how can that be, right? And I remember watching the footage as it's happening and just being, totally kind of struck by just how, again, you always think that this could happen, but you never, it's one thing to imagine it. It's another thing to see it play out in front of you,
Yeah. I saw
jarring.
one of the police officers today who's testified before Congress. His name is Officer Harry Dunn, African-American. And he heard so many racial slurs that day.
Right. Yeah.
At the end of the night, he wept in the rotunda. And he said, "Is this America?" And we've gotten to be friends since that day. And I happened to see him today, and I told him I was doing this talk tonight, and he said, "That's good for you, but it's hard to relive that day."
Yeah, no, I can't imagine, the trauma that these individuals went through as they're again, undertaking this Herculean task of trying to keep this mob out, to protect the senators and congressmen that were in the building that day, right? They put their lives on their line for other people.
Absolutely. And it was a very close call. It could have been even more of a bloodbath.
Yeah, I mean, I shudder to think of what would have happened if they'd gotten their hands on Romney or, on Pence, right? I mean, he was out 50 seconds beforehand, right? Or AOC. I know she wasn't in the building at the time, but they were looking for her, Pelosi, right? They had a list of who they wanted.
Oh, they did.
And had they gotten their hands on any of them, again.
Well, that leads into my remembering 2:00. We were an hour into the count. There were about 30 or 40 journalists, photographers, reporters, and probably 200 or 300 members on the floor. And that's when we heard that the rotunda has been breached, which is the most sacred space in the whole citadel. And but they told us only one individual had breached the rotunda. And so they carried on their business. And all of a sudden we heard many voices, footsteps pounding, broken glass on the marble floors, and these howls that didn't even sound quite human. And one lawmaker, his name is Steve Cohen from Memphis, Tennessee, he shouted over from the balcony to the Republican side. He said, "This is because of you." Meanwhile, some of the larger men were taking off their jackets, getting ready for a fight. And others were, kind of kneeling and hiding and putting on gas masks. And up in the balcony where we were told that we had to evacuate, but all the doors were locked. So that was a rather like an Edgar Allan Poe dilemma. And then we heard gunshots. And I covered the city of Baltimore for 10 years for the Baltimore Sun, and I never heard live gunshots until I was in the Capitol on this ritual, this constitutional ritual going on. And then we called our families. We remembered 2001, September 11th, that the Capitol was the target of the plane that crashed to the ground. So we didn't know if we were going to get out of there alive or not, but we somehow got to a secret staircase down it, and then to a house office building where we sheltered, and we were in lockdown for many hours. I don't know how many, but it just felt like a lifetime.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even the point about the secret staircase, I think this speaks to kind of the planning and the coordination, right? There's audio tape of the Oath Keepers, for example, who are fully aware of where those secret passages are. At one point, one of the Oath Keepers says they're down in the passages, gas them out, and again, like they had maps, they knew what they wanted to do, right? So it's kind of this duality, right? Yes, there was a large part of that crowd that was unorganized and kind of, got caught up in the moment, for a variety of reasons, right? I'm not saying they're innocent, but that they, showed up and then got, carried away. But there was absolutely a significant contingent that knew exactly what they wanted to do and used the crowd to their advantage.
Well, that was my worst fear, is that while we're going through this tunnel, that the mob would be coming this way toward us. I was walking along with the Ohio Congresswoman, Marcy Kaptur, who's in her 70s, a very senior Democrat. And she seemed calm with her pearls and her everything perfectly in place. And I was hyperventilating, and I said, "Congresswoman, why are you so calm?" And she said, "I've had a lot of hardship in my life." So somehow she calmed me down a little by saying that. But everybody reacts differently to crisis. I must say that almost everybody kept their cool. And, we followed in line. There wasn't like a rush to the exit. Everyone took off their shoes and went. A former NFL linebacker who's a member of the House said that he had never met his father, and now he was afraid that his wife was pregnant, that his son would never meet his father.
That's so
a lot of poignant testimonials.
Well, I can kind of give the counterpoint, right, which is like what's happening outside at that point, and I think it's striking, right, to kind of contrast what's happening inside the Capitol, like you're describing, and this fear and anxiety, right, and rightful, horror of everything, right, but at the same time online, they were loving it, right? The extremists, and not just the extremists, right? Patriot groups across the country were totally in awe of what was happening, right? They, especially in those early minutes, the first hour or so, there was almost, I would call it glee, this excitement, this joy that finally patriots are rising up after, so long of being stepped on by the left and being pushed around, that finally they're going to rise up, and restore the rightful place in the country, that this is the moment that they take back their country for themselves, that this is the beginning of a brand new dawn, for America. And I think that's reflected, right, in how much social media stuff was going up. People were live streaming, they were sharing photos, they were, again, like posting Facebook statuses saying, "We're here, can't believe this is happening." I mean, heck, people were sharing photos on dating apps, to brag. There was really like no shame around this, and so it made, in some ways it was, it's horrifying. In a lot of ways it was great because we were, my colleagues and I were able to immediately start tracking these people, start, grabbing these photos, saving them, saving the videos, so that we knew eventually they would get taken down, but we wanted to have them. And so we kind of were working, really around the clock, a few of us, to ID these folks, and pass that information on to law enforcement, really just kind of going post by post and verifying and making sure, trying to figure out if they're in the Capitol or not, based off of this imaging. But again, there was this wealth of content out there, hour-long videos, 2-hour-long videos because people didn't think they were doing anything wrong, right? They were standing up to save their country. What's bad about that? And really, this is a point of pride.
And there were thousands of them on the terrace, on the steps. I mean, they knew they had cased the joint, or somebody had cased the joint. And maybe with a little help from their friends in Congress, like this freshman, Lauren Boebert from Colorado, got up on the floor of the House before the mob arrived. And she said, "Madam Speaker, I'm going to be carrying my gun around here. And I have some constituents outside this building right now." It's a very brazen statement.
Right? I mean, it's a threat, right? Essentially a threat. Like, I've got people outside. She tweeted that morning, 1776. This is 1776. A whole host of them are rabble rousing and really egging the stuff on in dangerous ways.
And as I'm sure you know, several policemen lost their lives as a result, about 5. And you said, Alex, earlier that there was a change in the tenor around 3 o'clock.
Yeah. There was this fascinating moment. So at that time, I was actually watching the Oath Keepers private chat room, so like the hardcore guys. And there was this fascinating moment where, again, up until that point, there had been, uniform praise for what was happening, right? But then the tenor of the riot got worse, right? And we started to see much more violent imagery, much more kind of, egregious actions on the part of the insurrectionists. And there was this, all of a sudden, I started to see these comments like, "Oh, that's not us," right? "That's Black Lives Matter. That's Antifa. There's no way patriots, would do something like this," right? And I thought that was just absolutely fascinating. Pardon. I've been thinking about that moment, like, why has that happened, right? And I think the impulse comes from this idea that these guys, they see themselves in the insurrectionists, right? And they believe that they're the good guys. Because again, they're saving their country from evil, right? But it's very hard to square that concept with the footage they were seeing of, again, protesters beating police officers with American flags and defacing the Capitol and really, tearing down one of the greatest symbols. Yeah, of course, right? Defacing one of the great symbols of America and our freedom, right? And so that disconnect, that dissonance creates this urge, to say, "Oh, no, that's not us. That's Black Lives Matter. That's Antifa." And that impulse, I think, is incredibly important in terms of understanding kind of what's happened since, because what that has done is it has prevented the people, both there and the supporters of this, from kind of grappling with the role that their violent rhetoric and conspiracies played in the lead up to the insurrection, right? So rather than looking it in the face and changing, they've just basically, wiped their hands of it by saying, "That's Black Lives Matter, that's Antifa, that's not us," right? Which essentially means that the conditions that enabled the violence to happen in the first place are still in place. And even more dangerously, right? This impulse, that initial impulse to say "that's not us," has been kind of cynically exploited by, powerful figures around this country, to kind of writ large let people off the hook and deflect the blame elsewhere.
That's exactly what then President Trump said himself to Kevin McCarthy, the Republican leader in the House. He said, "That's Antifa. That's
right.
Just what you said." And to his credit, McCarthy said, "No, it's not. It's MAGA. I know who they are." So that was his brief moment of standing up to Trump. But even, Trump was leading just an hour or two earlier. He had incited and invited them to rush to the Capitol. And now he's trying to pass off the blame when this turns out to be way more violent and way more drastic, outrageous than anyone. Do you think anyone imagined it could be that vicious and brutal?
I mean, like you said, there's no
other than Stuart Rhodes.
Yeah, right. That's his, fantasy. look, there's no precedent for this. I think even the people who were there that day didn't think it was going to go off like this, right? A lot of the language leading up to it was focused on Antifa. There was absolutely a very strong contingent that was like attack, the government, right? We need to do something to stop this. But there was also a significant portion that was like, look, we have to be prepared to fight Antifa, right? Because think about where it comes, starting with like kind of Charlottesville and their school showdown there, it's been kind of a consistent theme that there will be clashes between, the right and left at any major rally, right? So I don't think they in the wildest dreams thought that that would be possible, that they could actually, and really, again, it was this, in there for them, right? A lucky break that the Capitol was not as well defended as it should have been, that they were able to overwhelm, and turn that fantasy into reality. But I mean, I don't know, right? I mean, whether or not they thought it was possible, I don't know. But it was, I know they dreamed about it, but there's a difference between dreaming about something and making it happen. But as we saw, they did it.
Yes, and that day was such an insult, and only one leader in the Capitol was prepared to have a select committee or commission to investigate the entire day and tonight, and that was Speaker Pelosi.
Yeah.
And the Senate voted down having a commission, so she went ahead with the committee. And that January 6th committee, I think you'll agree, is really going to town.
Yeah.
And, yeah.
No, absolutely. They're doing important work, right? But I think if the insurrection was an insult to our democracy, the behavior by elected officials since has been even worse, right? I mean, one could imagine a world where kind of, right, after an act like this, we all kind of take a step back and look again at what led to this and make sure, work together across the aisle to make sure that this never happens again, so whatever that means, right? Impeaching Trump for the second time and actually
that did happen.
Time. No, but like actually, convicting Trump.
Convicting him.
Convicting Trump, right? And holding him responsible, right? Censoring the congressmen and the senators who egged the crowd on or enabled it, right?
Or like Ted Cruz or Josh
Hawley, or censoring them, if not outright removing them from office, right? Or at least making it so they can't win the next election. But the fact of the matter is, most of these people are going to win again. You're right. So any number of things, right? Holding the people, right, like Steve Bannon and these pundits that kind of egg this stuff on accountable. And yet we've seen none of that, right? Instead, Republicans and the broader right have gone to their usual playbook, in order to undermine any effort to figure out how to stop it. And again, as a result, we're left in the same position. And actually, I would argue it's even worse than like kind of active obstruction. They're glorifying these people, right? They turned Ashley Babbitt into a martyr, right? The victim of a government that murdered her.
Those were the gunshots that we heard. We didn't know who was shooting who.
Right.
There was a gun standoff after that. She was, in a way, she was in military. She was QAnon. She embodied a lot of the trends that we were talking about. We're going to take questions in a moment. However, let me narrate the very end of the night, which was about 3:30. Much to their credit, Pence and Pelosi, McConnell and Schumer, all were very decided about coming back to finish the count. And Mike Pence, whatever you think about him, at least he did the right thing at the right time that day. And so we returned to the Capitol, which was cleared and somewhat cleaned, but you could see the destruction everywhere, the disrespect to the heart of democracy. And so the House and the Senate carried on the count, and still there were Republicans who made challenges even after all they went through, which caused an outburst even by Mitt Romney on the Senate floor. And they finally finished it. And that was a tremendous victory. I happened to be speaking with a 14-year-old boy who said, yeah, other countries have a coup, but we come back. That's the difference. And it turned out he was Speaker Pelosi's grandson, standing by a statue of Will Rogers. And I would say that in the very end of the night, democracy won, but not by much.
Yeah, I would unfortunately agree with that assessment.
So let me
Sorry, I'm just going to chime in. Hello, everyone. My name is Dina Zingaro. I help to organize SWAT Talks, and to help our two panelists tonight, I am going to be fielding some of your wonderful questions that have been coming in with rapid fire. The first one comes from Charles Goldberg from the class of 1972. Charles's question is, some political scientists, such as Barbara Walters, see a likelihood of continuing violence, even perhaps civil war. Do you still see a potential for this?
Oh, we thought that question would come up.
Do you want to take the first swing?
Let me give my take, and then you can chime in. Just a lot of scholars and journalists are saying that we're living the 1850s all over again. The level of anger and vitriol and threats and sedition. But the Civil War was so awful, even much worse than what we're going through now. And there were three catalysts to the Civil War that I don't see equivalents to right now, but I think psychologically that we're going through a huge, huge chasm, if not militarily. What do you say, Alex?
Well, I am, as my family knows, I am a big pessimist when it comes to this, right? I think the place to start, right, is nothing's written in stone, right? So everything I'm about to say can always be changed, right? And I think it's important to remember that because you have to keep fighting. But I am deeply concerned about the fate of this country just because of the way that, the right has undermined our electoral system, right? They have essentially created a machine that tells people that, if a Democrat wins, it's illegitimate, and not just illegitimate, it's dangerous to you, and I think it's important to remember that second part, right? Because these people aren't acting like on like general power politics, right? They don't think in those terms. They think of like, how do I protect my family? How do I keep my community safe? And they are constantly receiving messaging from social media, from news outlets, from elected officials that they trust, that's telling them that Democrats are evil, right? They are, in some horrible cases like Satanist tyrant pedophiles that are coming to kill you and your family and destroy your way of life.
And that's their source of news.
Right, exactly. I look at the stuff that these guys share. And again, it's not just extremists at this point. I see it on Facebook with normal people that are sharing, these outlandish conspiracy riddled pages, that again, raise the stakes away from policy disagreements into this kind of eternal struggle, between good and evil. And you look at that, and then you look at kind of the steps that have been taken to undermine our electoral system, right? Whether it's these bogus audits that even though they consistently come back as the votes were the same, there's always people saying, well, we need to do it again because clearly something's wrong and you were just corrupted, right? So the bogus audits, the changes in election rules to ensure that, the steal of the election can't happen again, right? Or the putting in of Trump cronies into these key electoral positions that govern the way our elections are run. Right, the groundwork is being laid, and
the voting rights just failed in Congress.
Right, exactly, and I think one of the things that scared me the most was the reaction to the Republican in Virginia, Youngkin. I'm blanking on his name right now, who just won in governor. Right, he won the election. He was a Republican, and yet you saw a spate of people saying, actually, that was rigged as well. The Democrats just want to throw us off their scent. So even in a scenario where the Republican won the election outright, there's still conspiracies saying this stuff has, that this has been stolen or rigged in some way, right? And we're seeing that the effects of that. Polling numbers change, depending on who you ask, but the majority consistently of Republicans say that the election was stolen or that they believe that something shady happened, right? Mm-hmm. And that hasn't gone down. We measured kind of traction on social media, and that has continued up to this point.
On that note, Alex, could you give us a little, we actually had one of our audience members just wanted a reminder of what organization you work for and why you were spending, that piece of your job where you're spending so much time on social media. If you could sort of explain that bit of your job. And also this question comes from me, but I'm just sort of curious, what have you seen with the online chats or online discussions happening with members of the Oath Keepers or the Proud Boys Have they gone underground? Did they go underground and then resurface? What have you seen?
Sure. So I work for the Anti-Defamation League. I'm in their Center on Extremism, and essentially we track extremism, wherever it goes, right? Far left to the far right. And basically the way we do that is we go where, the extremists go on social media. And we are just flies on the wall. We watch them day in and day out to kind of get a sense of, what they're planning, what's motivating them, and things that they might consider the real world, right? With the idea being that, we shine a light on these guys so that we can help inform media, communities, law enforcement, whoever the stakeholder may be, right? We arm them with the information about what these guys are talking about, what they're planning next, to kind of keep tabs on them. And so in terms of like the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys and kind of where we're at with these extremists now, they've actually kind of gone in some different paths, right? So by and large, after the insurrection, all of the major social media platforms deplatformed these guys, right? They kicked them off, right, off of Facebook, off Twitter, off Reddit, off things of those natures. Some have been a little bit longer than others. Some of those bans have been longer and a little bit more thorough. But by and large, these guys were kind of removed from those spaces. And so as a result, we saw them navigate to other extremist platform or sorry, secondary and tertiary platforms, spaces that either popped up, to kind of cater to this new audience, right? Or places that had been around for a while, but for a variety of reasons, usually they're actually just pretty awful, like functionally, they just never took off. And so we saw people start to move towards those spaces. And that really impeded the ability of these extremist groups to get their message out and to recruit new people because there wasn't a coordinated plan of what do you do after you leave Facebook. Like they had to kind of figure out and they really kind of struggled to get a foothold anywhere. In terms though of their actions, right? And I think the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers are really fascinating in terms of the different paths that they've taken. So the Proud Boys over the last year have shifted their focus. They've tried to decentralize, right? So it used to have a much stronger national group but now they're actively encouraging, local chapters to take, matters into their own hands. And as part of that, they've encouraged kind of this move away from national politics and instead focus on local politics, right? So go to your school board meetings, go to your town council meetings, harass the medical professional in your neighborhood, right? And if you follow the news, you'll notice there's a lot of stories about Proud Boys showing up in random towns, and standing in the back of a council meeting, with their mask on and just kind of 4 or 5 of them just glaring, and just sending that threatening message in those instances where they don't actively grab the microphone themselves, right? So they have kind of continued, despite 40 of them being charged in connection with the insurrection, they have continued to engage in street fights against the left, right? In Portland in particular, we saw an escalation from, sticks and clubs to paintball guns to actual pistols being drawn, and people, shots fired in anger. Right. So they have continued to kind of seize this moment and use like the notoriety that's come along with the insurrection to further their cause. In contrast, the Oath Keepers, have struggled this year for a variety of reasons. And I think part of it, this is just speculation on my part, but I think part of it is the kind of sway that Stuart Rhodes has over the organization, right? He founded the group. He's the president of the group for life. He has dictated basically every major strategic choice that they have made over the last 13 or so years. And he has always been in the crosshairs of law enforcement in regards to the insurrection, right? He, from the very first indictments that came out against those 3 members of the Oath Keepers, Thomas Caldwell, Donovan Krall, and Jessica Watkins, right? He was always person 1 in those papers, right? And he was acutely aware of the fact that he was likely going to go at the prison at some point. He at one point gave a speech where he said, I'm going to end up in prison. They're going to throw me in jail. And so I think because of that, because of that wariness, he kind of was a little bit quieter, right? So the Oath Keepers have not been particularly active in any organized way over the last year. Yes, you see Oath Keepers show up on their own, but there hasn't been these kind of unified calls for action, which is kind of their trademark, thing where they'll arrange a whole group of people to go, to a protest or a rally, or even, in the wake of natural disaster to go help out. They have been largely quiet and stymied because of the legal scrutiny.
We have a question from Gino Bottino. What % of, this is as best as you can tell, what % of participants were true insurrectionists versus, quote, normal people caught up in the moment that day?
Yeah, that's impossible to tell at this point, right? I mean, the best kind of numbers I can give are 20% of the individuals were extremists, right? Whether that was Oath Keepers or Proud Boys or QAnon supporters or a variety of white supremacist gangs. But that's terrifying in my mind because that means 80% of those people were, again, seemingly ordinary Americans that showed up and again went along with it, right? Plenty of folks peeled off before they got to the Capitol. They didn't have to go to the Capitol, and yet they went and did what they did, right? But again, I think it's the power of the messaging, right? The fact that this messaging is happening across all sectors at all hours of the day, from sunrise to sunset. That again, seemingly ordinary people are consuming it and are now believing that great things must be done in order to save the country, extraordinary things.
So let's shift a little bit to sort of the where we are now, over a year later. And we have a question here from Bill Lee from the class of 1960. Do you think that the January 6th committee is doing a good job? Are they moving fast enough? And perhaps we can sort of tack on to that question, sort of the sentences that we have seen coming down, if you could sort of discuss that a bit.
My sense is that they're in a big hurry because if the Republicans take over the House in the next election, then they will disband that committee. And so I sense this urgency on their part. The fact that they've interviewed 300 witnesses, including Bill Barr, and they seem to be putting together a big mosaic of who was involved that day. And they don't seem to have any fear or any, limits at this point, who they'll subpoena. And they've invited Ivanka Trump. So this is sending signals that they're for real, they're serious. And would you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, I would. I think they're doing the best that they can given the political limitations that they have. I think you're absolutely right, Jamie, in that, they know there's a clock on their ability to do, put a report out, which is, whatever the results of this next election are, right? I mean, the expectation is it isn't going to go great. And so they're trying to get it done before then, so I think there's an enormous amount of information to go through and an enormous amount of evidence that they have to cull through. And so, again, they're doing what they can. And so there has been some important findings that has come out of the work already. So I'm hopeful that again, with a few more months, they'll be able to keep kind of picking away at some of these questions that still remain, that need to be answered if we're going to fully understand, what happens on that day. In terms of just this, sorry.
Two of the members led the impeachments, the two Trump impeachments, Jamie Raskin and Adam Schiff. So in a way, they've been down the Trump road before, and I think they will leave no stone unturned. The two Republicans on the committee, Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, are of the same mind. And in a way, it was a blessing that Speaker Pelosi rejected Jim Jordan and others to be on that committee, because otherwise it would have run into a lot of turbulence.
Absolutely.
So we have two questions that are sort of similar in nature. So I'm just going to pair the two of them up. So the first one comes from Peter Plocky from the class of 79. And Peter was sort of asking, this otherwise lawless mob apparently abided by the DC firearms prohibition. They could have ignored the law and brought concealed firearms into the Capitol. Fortunately, they didn't. Any thoughts on why not? And to sort of go along with that, there's so many questions I just want to. Mike Stafford asked a similar question, that if even a small percentage of the group was organized for a premeditated overthrow, why weren't guns and explosives more widespread on that day?
Yeah, no, fantastic questions. One of the things is that we're learning as these kind of cases go on is there were more guns than we thought were brought to the Capitol. They're consistently, updating how the guns that were recovered on that day. But it's a great question on why they weren't fired in anger. I'm not sure. I'm not sure why. It could be that there just weren't, necessarily targets for them to shoot at, right? I mean, these guys still generally, again, even though there was this blatant disregard of law enforcement on the day, they still, again, tend to side with law enforcement, and they didn't get their hands on, the people that they were hoping to get their hands on. I don't know, why there weren't more people that opened fire. It's actually one of the questions I continue to have to this day, but I can say that, again, the chatter leading up to it, a lot of people were passing around information saying, do not bring guns. Like that will just immediately get you arrested. They will throw, again, they didn't know what law enforcement, what level of law enforcement they were going to face that day. Right. So people, like, the quickest way to get removed from that and to crack the whole thing down is for people to be walking around openly with guns, like they have been doing at the lockdown protests across the country, that they have been doing at all sorts of different rallies. And so there was this real effort to not do that. But again, it wasn't don't bring weapons. It was bring things that they can't take away from you, right? So bring batons, bring bats, bring concealed knives, bring all of these types of things.
Bring the bear spray.
Bring the bear spray, right? So even though they didn't have classic firearms, right, what you think of a weapon in the classic sense, in the American sense of it, right, they still had plenty of weapons. They were armed to the teeth and they were ready to rock.
Again, I'm going to pair up two questions here from alum. Chris Tananoun, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly, from the class of 72, asks, you have mentioned the importance of the messaging on the right. How can or should it be countered? Which I'd like to pair up with another question that came in from Sandra Smith. What have you found out about the extreme left? Is there actually a group called Antifa, or is that just a fantasy of the right? And I'd like to pair these two up because I'm sort of curious, Alex, if if this sort of online extremist chatter is something that is evident on the left, if members of the ADL have also seen that, is it similar? Is it different?
Yeah, for sure. So let's start with the question about the left, and then we can talk generally about kind of extremist messaging, right? And the fact of the matter is, like, yes, there is some extremist, like far left extremist messaging where they talk about violence, but it's not nearly at the levels that we see with the right. And again, we are constantly looking because we always get asked about this, about this type of issue. In terms of Antifa, they exist and they don't exist, right? So they exist in that, yes, there is this kind of collective of people called Antifa, that will show up, again, they kind of know the order of business, right? And some places there is a little bit more, like there's more cohesion, right? There's people that tend to show up for these things. But in general, right, they aren't a formalized group. There is no formal structure to them. There is no hierarchy. There is nothing really that kind of links them, right? Instead, what you tend to see are small cells of people who show up again at various places and engage in their activities, right? By and large, Antifa has been turned into a boogeyman by the right. It's not to say that they don't use violence. There are absolutely instances where, members of Antifa, followers of Antifa, Antifa adherents have used violence, but it's very limited and tends to reflect a small, kind of the anarchist wing of Antifa. Antifa gets a lot of attention when they show up to counter protests, but they do lots of other things as well. Whether it's community organizing, helping provide goods and services, give stuff to the local communities, online, kind of monitoring, right? Similar stuff to what I do, like kind of keeping an eye on these spaces and identifying folks when they can, as white nationalists, as Nazis, as what have you. And again, their big thing is they don't show up unless the right shows up, right? And that's an important differentiator, right, between the two. Now, again, like the violence that Antifa does should absolutely be condemned. It's not good, right? No one should be using violence. And frankly, it ends up just creating cycles of violence, which are deeply problematic and only make things worse. But, I always think back to a statistic that we put out over last year, right? Over the last 10 years, we've seen 433 murders committed by extremists across the country. Only one of those was carried out by Antifa, and it was the first murder that we saw connected with an Antifa adherent since 1994. And that was the Michael Reinhold shooting in Portland in the wake of Michael Reinhardt shooting the Patriot Prayer member in Portland, right? But in that same time, we've seen 75% of those murders committed by the far right, and far more plots that were foiled and stopped committed by the far right, right? So when you kind of look at the two, it's very obvious that there is an undue amount of violence coming out of the right as compared to the left. in terms of messaging, right, and it's an incredibly important question that we're still trying to sort through, right, is how do we counter this messaging, right? So on the one hand, right, you can do counter messaging, right? I tend to think that's, sort of limited in what it can do because people don't trust where the sources where it's coming from, right? But there's things you can do like hold social media accountable, right? I don't think it's unreasonable for people who are using Facebook, who are using Twitter, who are using Reddit to expect that these platforms will take the presence of extremists seriously and deplatform it and make sure that, they and their kids and their grandkids aren't seeing this stuff, while they're just scrolling around, checking up on their feeds. So there's sorts of things like that where you can kind of do. I think another thing, right, is from politicians, and elected officials, holding them accountable at the ballot box, making sure, right, there used to be a time that if you said something outrageous or outlandish or you advocated for violence, you would lose your next election, right? And someone from your same party would take that opportunity to kind of, jump ahead. And that just isn't the case. If anything, we're seeing these people rewarded for their dangerous comments, right, for the violent rhetoric, right? It becomes now about owning the left as opposed to running on policy or running on, decorum in the country. And then I think, part of it is just kind of understanding at an individual level, right, what these people are doing with their propaganda, how to recognize propaganda, how to talk to people about it, right? Because everyone has loved ones, or many people have loved ones that have fallen down this trap, right? And it's very difficult to bring them back, but, that's one way you can kind of counter the messaging is by kind of working with them to figure out, to identify this stuff, right? And it's really hard work. It takes a lot of empathy, a lot of patience, and a lot of time, frankly, to do it, right? There's no good way to drag them back, towards reason, towards kind of these norms, right? You have to guide them there, and that takes a lot of time, but is incredibly important.
Is it a kind of contagion, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, you can absolutely think about it. I mean, the term going viral, right? I mean, how many of these conspiracies start off in the middle of nowhere and then all of a sudden end up on, some of the major broadcasts in America, and that's absolutely kind of this contagion element of it.
So we only have 2 minutes now. So I just want to give you both an opportunity to close with a few of your thoughts, or if there's an anecdote that you didn't get a chance to share about that day. I want to leave this time for the two of you.
Do you want me? I guess I'll start just because you probably have a better anecdote about the day. Although better might be the wrong word to use here. I don't know. I think one of the things I struggle with in my job is that I'm usually the bearer of bad news. I'm not a lot of fun at cocktail parties. People want to ask me about what I do or my outlook on things, and I don't usually have good news. And I just kind of want to go back to the point I made before I started talking about kind of like whether or not we're heading towards a civil war, right? The future's unwritten. Yes, this is a dark period. I'm very concerned about the way our political system is operating or not operating for that matter right now. I'm very concerned watching, large segments of Americans, fall prey to these extremist ideologies, or get caught up in things like QAnon and all that sort of stuff, but it's important to kind of, keep working and figure out there are solutions to this. You can't just kind of resign ourselves and walk away, and say whatever happens, happens, right? The only way we're going to stop this is if we kind of, work together and organize and keep pushing forward for a better, regardless of your politics, right? Just keep pushing forward for a better America.
Well, as the evening was ending, I happened to see Chris Van Hollen, Senator from Maryland, whom I knew at Swarthmore. And we were by the Ohio clock, and he's just talking, like trying to make some sense out of the whole event. And he said, Mike Pence was really furious after all I've done for that guy. So then home, and the streets were deserted. We were under curfew. Everything was dark. And by the time I finally got home at 4 a.m, it was the darkness before the dawn, which seemed to be a very good metaphor for where we were as a country at that moment.
Well, thank you both so much, Alex and Jamie, and thank you to everyone for tuning in for tonight's SWAT Talk.
Thank you, friends.
Well, everyone.